Hello everyone and welcome to our lunchtime lecture, It's the Historical Truth of Fantasy with Jonny White. We are now halfway through our summer programme of virtual events and are extremely grateful for the help and generosity of a number of parents, colleagues and alumni without whom none of this would have been possible. I wanted to say a big thank you to all of you for joining us today. Your generous donations at registration for this event have helped raise over £300 for our bursary appeal, a key part of our Inspiring Minds campaign. Thank you so much for your continued support. This year saw a significant growth in the number applying for bursaries throughout the school, and we are delighted that our appeal will be able to fund 5 new bursaries from September. Okay, a few house rules. We're going to put everyone on mute so you can all hear the presentation clearly, and please feel free to type any questions in the chat facility throughout the talk and send to all, so we are able to moderate and avoid duplication of questions. Jonny will answer as many of these questions as he can during the talk and others at the end as time allows. Turning to this lunchtime's programme, we are delighted to welcome Latimer's Head of History, Jonny White. Jonny had a career in publishing after university before turning his hand to the English language and then history teaching. He has taught in both state and independent sectors, and as well as teaching in Egypt for 4 years. Today, Jonny will focus his talk on the slippery issue of what we mean by objective historical truth. Without further ado, Jonny, over to you.
We live in what we're called a post-truth society, truth being the plaything of populist politicians and social media. And so truth is at its most valuable as a currency at the moment. And of course, historical truth even more so, because a lot of the energy of social conflict now is focused around identity and narratives of identity. And I think that that would be true. That's true of both the left and the right. That's true of Black Lives Matter that want to see, rightly in my view, curricula decolonized to tell their stories, see the black face in British history, let's say, for the sake of argument, obviously American history too. But it's also true, equally true, arguably of the right, that if there's something that they would both agree on, they would both agree that they wanted to see the ancestry, memory, who am I, where have I come from? They can both agree that that's important. And so if that's true, then history becomes therefore the battleground of our, or the at least battleground might be too conflictual, but the area of contested ground in history faculties. And there's a third reason, of course, which is to do with arguably where this has come from, which is culturally the postmodern project, if that's the right word, in the last 50, 60 years. And Roland Barthes famously said that in his book, La Morte d'auteur, that the author is dead, that we are storytelling animals, homo narrans. But his book here sets a depth charge under the assumptions that went all the way back to Herodotus, which is that through critical reading of texts and sources, you can reach valid historical judgments. And Roland Barthes really questions that completely. And the play is on the words, La Morte d'Arthur, which is an assembly of Malory's legends about Arthur. Of course, in French, means you can hear Le mort d'Arthur, the death of the author. And essentially, Barthes' contention is look at where the power lies in the consumption of any text. Is it actually, does it go from primary source, filtered through chronicler to historian to editor to reader? And we're trying to scramble upwards towards what the primary source means. That's really where meaning resides. And Barthes' contention is no, to understand the author's identity and context is actually to limit the power structures of the source. And the clincher is the impression of the reader is refracted through signs and meanings they attribute, and language is slippery, and so we ultimately are always subjective in the way that we read. As he famously said, it's the destination that matters. And I suppose that on one level this emancipates the reader, it emancipates the undergraduate from the authority of the lecturer, the authority of the author. And it also, of course, puts paid to what we might call the canon of what is and what isn't, whatever is and isn't important. And ultimately, therefore, questions whether there is such a thing as history at all. I was just trying to school myself in postmodern theory, and I fell upon that chapter, you know, the death of history, that we really can't ever say anything which is uncontestable. And this is what I grew up with. I grew up with grand narratives of the rise and fall of classes. I grew up with the rise and fall of institutions, the formation of nations. But now the contemporary sensibility is identities. That is what should be the business of history. Just at the time when postmodernity was questioning, just questioning whether there is such a thing as any objective truth. Frank Anna Schmidt saying, don't study history, just study historians. Diane Purkis, who's a specialist in witch trials, was saying it doesn't matter whether it happened or not. I mean, the misogyny is so endemic, culturally endemic, we don't even need to bother whether things happened or not. It's got a post-structuralist account. And it had very, very fertile things to do in history writing in the 1970s. Arguably, you could say two of the most interesting books that emerged in the 1970s. I mean, one was about a group of printers putting on trial the cats of the area, in particular the master printer in this arrondissement in Paris in the 18th century, and then massacring them. And another one, The Cheese and the Worms by Carlo Ginzburg, was basically a micro-history of the blasphemous beliefs of an Italian miller in the 16th century. So you know, do we study that? Or do we study that? So the perspective of what history is about, you know, i.e. what should we be even looking at? What kind of questions are we being asked? Are literally deconstructed. And as an analogy, you can see this by looking at the American architect Daniel Libeskind's wonderful deconstructivist extension of the Royal Ontario Museum. Now, this is what it looked like when it was initially built in 1913, you know, reassuring, neo-Romanesque building, and we go to the museum to find out about the past of Ontario. And then after 2013, Libeskind, his extension, looks like that, and really is playing with our expectations of, you know, how we would encounter the past. We're disoriented, you know, what's up and what's down. You know, where are the reassuring 90-degree angles in this building? And interestingly, how the hell do I get in? You know, where's the door? And so it's a wonderful sort of physical expression of what actually had happened to the discipline, what's happened to history, in terms of it can be what you want. You don't know where you should be looking at it from. And so this hypersubjectivity is, of course, worrisome. It's bothering, because if campuses are going to get shoutier, if identities are going to be, if you like, pressing their case for the sake of example, then are we history has to subsist on reaching some kind of consensus on what kinds of questions are being asked and what serves as objective truth. And so therefore, do we have to resign ourselves to a kind of pessimistic hyper relativism? Because after all, we need to start a conversation, is a phrase that you'll hear particularly from many activists, and conversations are to be had because we want to achieve consensus. We want to settle for something that's going to bind us together as values, and particularly when we're discussing our past. And so therefore, do we need to hold our heads in despair, if you like, on pessimism of hyper-relativism, that all truths will be relative, and therefore I can tell my past, you can tell your past, and it's equally valid. A lot of you may have heard of a book, a famous book called What is History, by E.H. Carr, and you can probably work out, if you have, why I'm showing you pictures of the Matterhorn. And it's derided, this book, because you're supposed to have read it, but then of course when you work it out, a lot of people haven't. But it's a sparkling series of lectures, and he asks this question. He says, well, what has happened, the past, does it have an independent reality? Before we even start to talk about it, is there a thing that we're trying to observe? And unless you're going to be Berkeley and say, well, the noise in the primeval forest is only a noise if it's been heard, that's to say, if there was someone to hear it. Unless you believe that, well, we all accept there is something the past that we're trying to capture, and very often that past isn't captured. The voice of the galley slave, the voice of the housemaid, the voice of the miner, they're lost, of course, but nevertheless they lived, and there is a past, there is an independent reality. And so he says, well, what's interesting, of course, is that this reality, let's stick with this analogy, is like a mountain, and I can observe it. And if I look at it from there, it looks like that. And if I look at it from the north, it looks like that. If I look at it from the southwest, it looks like that. And so when I'm describing the mountain, in fact, my description is changing. And here's my favorite one from above, because all historians fantasize about the eagle's view, the eagle-eyed view, not the microhistory is the worm's eye view, but the eagle-eyed view, that's the one that makes you, as a historian, think that you're somehow seeing the footfall of God, as Bismarck would have put it. So as soon as you talk about the past, of course, what you're really doing is you're giving away where you are. You're giving away your perspective, and does that bother Carr? He says, well, it does not follow that because a mountain appears to take on a different shape from different angles of visions, it is objectively either no shape or an infinity of shapes. It's something that that we have to we have to get around. We have to get around this idea. We have to accept this idea that there is an independently existing past that may or may not have been captured by sources to our satisfaction, but nevertheless it exists out there. Would anyone like to, I'm going to stop there because I've already said a bit. Would anyone like to, I can't see that, I'll have a look at the chat now and see if anyone's got anything about that. And no one has. So I think you just ought to say hello to each other or something, and I'll press on. And someone's got to pluck up the courage to say, what a load of rubbish, or something like that is great. And I'm going to carry on anyway with my observations, which is, of course, there is a problem with this mountain analogy, isn't there? And assuredly, this is the problem. Mountains are static. They're unchanging masses. Okay, let's disregard the geological point. Things change as slowly as UCAS policy, a geological time. Okay, there's a geological time, but essentially E.H. Carr's analogy is that breaks down because actually history is about the history of change from one thing to another. It's a narrative, there's movement. And the second reason why this breaks down up to a point is that history is also an empirical subject about human intent and will, and of course not just individuals, but societies as well, which is very, very slippery and very, very difficult. And to illustrate that point, we might say, okay, anthropologists deal with human behavior as if it's static, but historians deal with human behavior as a happening, and that's the difference in the two disciplines. And let's take, for example, this handshake. Now, if I'm an anthropologist, how am I going to behave? How am I going to sort of explain that handshake? I might say something about there has been some accord, and essentially humans show they're not armed, and they show the palm of their hand to demonstrate that, and they clutch it into this timeless gesture of armlessness. Well, obviously, a historian, that's never going to make it into a history book. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be explaining the before and after. I'm going to be explaining that handshake in terms of American foreign policy, in terms of the Intifada, etc., what happens before and after. And therefore, history, its argument with the social sciences, although social sciences are so useful to historians, our social sciences deal with states as if society is a static thing, and across borders. But history is about the particular. It's about it's about events, and therefore we say to the postmodernists that Barth's insight, I mean, the thing about Barth's insight, the death of the author, is that do I believe you? You're the author, I can say what I like about Barth. Authority depends upon believing him. But there is this impulse, we do have this impulse to tell the story, and not only this impulse to tell the story, but to explain it as well. And it won't go away. It won't go away. And Gibbon famously, of course attempts this idea of historical explanation. Isidore Saville, the medieval chroniclers, wouldn't bother. Chroniclers compile narratives because it expresses the will of God. You don't need to explain it. It's within the mystery. And that sort of holds good up until the 18th century, where Gibbon's writing this astonishing account of the decline of Rome, and wrongly, that's next week, wrongly attributes it to the collapse of to Christianity, because he says, for his view, the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, all of these things were lost in the superstition of Christianity, the barbarism of Christianity, and therefore that accounts for it. So history is becoming explanatory, and this is where historians were trying to align themselves, of course, with what scientists said they could do. Except there is a problem, and this is a knotty one. This is something I always ask my sixth form students. What is the difference between scientific causation and historical causation? And it's a very fertile question to ask. Let's say an event in science might be, I boil water to 100 degrees and it boils. So I've got my causal relationship, and I'm fairly confident that I can establish that, recreate it time and time again. I can rehearse it, and it's going to become a necessary cause. And the joy of science is it can create its own evidence to modify variables to create a fairly incontestable causal relationship. Now, how's that different to the historian that wants to find an objective explanation for why something happens? And I can't see the chat, but you can check it in. I mean, I'm sure you're all saying something like, well, firstly, historians can't reconstruct events. I can't unshoot Franz Ferdinand. And also, if I'm dealing with something like the French Revolution, then any historical judgment is multi-causal. And consequently, these multi-causal relationships are also unique and particular. They're impossible to replicate. You might say if boiling a kettle is a unique event, in time it certainly is, but it's ultimately replicable, which of course historical event isn't, because each individual, each time, each space is particular. There's an infinite particularity which ultimately makes history an art rather than the science. And that did it for Karl Popper famously in 1957 with historicism. He was reacting against the idea that history did have general laws. And he says this, insofar as a scientific statement speaks about reality, it must be falsifiable. And insofar as it is not falsifiable, it does not speak about reality. Well, what's his problem with history causation? You can't falsify anything. You can't take away what's happened. You can't unshoot, as I said, Franz Ferdinand, unless you're a counterfactual historian, and then you're going into the realms of speculation. So you can never show that a historical cause was necessary. There's a second issue that might be a problem for objectivity, which is the categories that we use, the ideal types, and this is where postmodernity is very fertile, is what do we actually mean by church, empire, revolution? These are, of course, constructs. I mean, if you take church, it can be Billy Graham, it can mean the Pope, it can mean a building. So we're always attributing the particular to a universal category, and there's always an exchange between those two things, between the language we use to describe something. For example, the word Reformation. I mean, now historians say, well, there wasn't one Reformation. There were lots. There was one in the 12th century under Pope Gregory. And if there were lots of Reformations, then that devalues what happened in the 16th century. It becomes lots. If there's lots, it was always in a state of flux, so that word's no use to me. So there's this exchange. I mean, Europeans used to think, everything that until the 17th century, categories are defined by their properties. So, for example, if I use the word swan as a European, I mean a white bird that lives on water, don't I? That's what a swan is. So if I say that a swan is white, I can see a swan. I can then deductively say, and that swan, but then that bird is white. Well, what happened in the 17th century? Dutch explorers on the coast of northwest Australia discovered a black swan. And therefore, that category had to change. The properties of that category had to change. The scientist doesn't have to bother with that. When a scientist uses a universal term, a category like sodium, they have demonstrable properties that people can agree with. I'm simplifying it, but you take the point. Therefore, it's problematic. Does anyone have any? I'll have a look in the chat now and see if anyone has any comments. Oh,
Mike.
Thanks, Tom. Mike, do you want to unmute and say something?
Bit tricky. I'm having my lunch, but
oh. What are you eating?
Turkey sandwich. I wasn't entirely following your argument in terms of what you're knocking. I mean, you know, stuff has gone on from time immemorial. We know stuff has gone on, just like the mountain is there. So I didn't kind of quite grasp your point about what's wrong with thinking about the past.
Oh, I don't think there is anything wrong with the past, but I think we always need to be aware of what we actually mean when we use the word, for example, cause. Some postmodern, Popper said that you shouldn't have the word cause in any history book. Because you can't falsify the relationship that you're making. It's much more indeterminate than that. So historical description is itself contingent. It depends on what you choose to describe and the language you choose to describe it in. And historical explanation, obviously the why, is even more problematic. It becomes even harder because of Popper's objection.
So can I ask you then something? So are
yes.
you saying, you know, Henry VIII having 8 wives is a contingent fact, not an actual fact?
No, it's a historical fact. It's incontestable. But then it depends what you do with it and why you think it's important. But why he had 6 wives is ultimately something that's undemonstrable, according to Popper's view.
Okay, I got it. I think. Thank you.
So, right now, there's no. I was saying that's what Gibbon was. Gibbon was attempting these explanations, and of the collapse of the Roman Empire, for example, and Mike's rightly saying we're sounding too pessimistic here about what history can actually achieve, and I would say that probably the most influential figure in the formation of the historical profession is this figure, this German Leopold von Ranke, who really is the creator of history as a separate discipline. Before the 18th century, with a few exceptions, there weren't any history faculties in any European universities. I mean, Gibbon himself was a graduate in theology and philosophy, and there was a good reason for that. It was a view held since the Greeks that the reason for studying history was, of course, to study what was right and what was wrong, what good lives were and bad lives were, in a sort of moralistic way. So ultimately, it was theological or philosophical. Now, von Ranke takes a different view to Gibbon, because what he dislikes about Gibbon's and the 18th century's view of the past is it's obviously value driven. And can you see the values there? Light, darkness, light. That's to say that really Europeans were recovering what had been lost, but there's ultimately a cycle. And taking that view of the past was itself a value judgment. Now, underlying that view is the view that all human nature is essentially unchanging, that we were truer to ourselves in the classical world and our capacities and our abilities, which were then lost in the medieval world, and we somehow kind of recovered them. And so therefore in the 18th century mind, there's not really much distance between us and the ancient worlds. And this is one way that might be put about it. I mean, in the 18th century, here's Charles Fox, no problem putting him in a Roman toga. But von Ranke says this is wrong because it's actually ignoring the past, the distance we have from those that we study in the past. This is Lewis, actually, C.S. Lewis, saying all medieval narratives about the past are lacking in a sense of period. It was known that Adam went naked till he fell, and after that medieval people pictured the whole past in terms of their own age, so indeed did the Elizabethans, so did Milton. He never doubted that capon and white broth would have been as familiar to Christ and to the disciples as to himself. It is doubtful whether the sense of period is much older than the Waverley novels, he says. All right, well, who wrote the Waverley novels? It is, of course, Walter Scott, writing in the same time as Gibbon. And so what's happened is the French Revolution has created this seismic shift in the way that we see the past. Are we so enlightened with the guillotine, with the terror, with the dictatorship that ultimately emerged from the French Republic in the form of Napoleon's dictatorship, and therefore von Ranke would really doubt, for example, Adam Smith's view here that we are the same as our ancestors, and that we are cut from the same, we have the same passions and the same drives. And so consequently, if we're not the same, if there is a distance, then what von Ranke says is we've made the mistake of judging the past, assigning the task of judging the past, of instructing the present for the benefit of future such high offices. This work does not aspire. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to say that one era was better than another or more enlightened than another. Why not? I seek to only to show how it actually happened, or how it actually was, wie es eigentlich gewesen. So consequently, von Ranke is being optimistic, you would say, that he's saying, right, we've got to establish the facts that Mike was talking about. What really bothered him, in fact, was that when he read the Waverley novels, he loved the historicization, the idea that you get in Walter Scott, that the Middle Ages are weird and they're peculiar and we're miles away from them and that they're different to us. But what he didn't like was that he realized there were factual errors. And so therefore what von Ranke is doing is saying, right, we need to learn philology, we need to read sources, we need hermeneutic theory, we need to understand documents. And that means that history in the mid-19th century is becoming a profession in its own right. It's got its own first journal was von Siebel's Historische Zeitschrift. It means that although there was a Regius Professor of Cambridge, his history at Cambridge in the 18th century, it was much derided and not that important. And I just wonder if postmodernity has actually overthrown this. In the debate over pulling down Edward Colston's statue, we're coming back to von Ranke. We're saying, all right, where are we on this? Are we going to sit in judgment, or which is possible, or are we not? What's historically valid? And in order to do this, which is brilliant from my point of view, we've got to get to the historical facts that exist. History should obviously be compulsory for everybody up to the age of 18. It's going to become very, very important. Von Ranke says something interesting about gaps in evidence as well. Something that tends to be always a problem for historians is what do you do with the gaps? Here's the gap in the famous aqueduct in the Campagna, linking the mountains to Rome. And we can't see the whole aqueduct. At this wonderful poster, of course, you remember it in the underground 19th century of what looks like a white police officer pursuing a a black guy in the street, and of course they're both, the recruitment poster said, well, they're actually both police officers and one is in plain clothes and they're pursuing. What you can't see, the gap in your evidence is you can't see that they're running after someone, a white suspect. So what do we do about that? And von Ranke has a solution, that we have intuition. We're born with intuition to imagine those gaps, and they have to be enough. Otherwise, we can't make any sense of the past. And if we look at that aqueduct, I think we can see that there is a line. In the 19th century, they see a line, a development in the historical process where there are those scripts and scraps of knowledge, that we can at least use our empathy and use our intuition to say something that's valuable about it. I'll give you an example, which I think might let you get you to see what I'm driving at. E.H. Carr, in his book What is History, quotes this famous judgment by Churchill about the origins of the Greco-Turkish War from 1919 to 1921. And what it refers to is that Alexander I of Greece was sitting in the royal gardens, and then he was bitten by his pet monkey in 1920 and died of sepsis. And that meant that his father, Constantine, who was reactionary, came back from exile and then launched a war against Turkey, which was very bitter and very vicious, cost 250,000 lives. Now, somehow all of us have a sense that there's something wrong. Intuition. We're using von Ranke's intuition. There's something wrong about this causation, this causal relationship. It doesn't quite square. Because we're beginning to stray into what we're going to call accidents, or we're going to call something into contingent. That's to say, a very, very small thing can't produce a huge outfall. Small cause enormous consequence, unless there's reference to a general context. And somehow that intuition comes from our own observations and our own good sense that wars are generally about contest for land, they're generally about ancestral disputes, that somehow that there's something in the Greco-Turkish relationship that means that this accident is having a disproportionate impact, because a small causal link has reached the crossroads of a large causal pathway to have this catalytic effect. But that sentence doesn't stand. Don't care whether he won the prize, whatever literary prize he won. I can't remember now. Someone can say this is not particularly good history. Yes, accidents, if you like everything else, are determined and caused, but they're independent and on external causal sequences. Trotsky put it beautifully when he said, how do we deal with accidents? He says, it's just the opening of the sluice gates of necessity is the way that he put it. Okay, von Ranke is saying that we're storytelling animals. We have intuitions that shape our historical judgments, and facts are the sword and shield against hyper-relativism. And I'm going to make I'm just looking at the time, and I'm realizing that I'm probably not going to get through quite everything that I thought I might. So I'll try and summarize how I think we square this. And I think ultimately my outlook's shaped by this figure, Hegel, and this amazing insight he has, which is building on what von Ranke's saying, which is so influential, remains influential, I think, even in the universities today, super influential on how we view our past. Do I dare? I'll have a go in the time we've got. And what Hegel's saying is, okay, history isn't just one damned thing after another. It's got a design to it. Now, it don't have to be. What's fascinating is it could have a design, if you like, with no designer. That there's a rationality outside of the intent and the particularity of us as humans. It's not such an abstract view, actually, because in fact the very, very same thing had been happening in political economy with Adam Smith. You'll be familiar with this, of course, that in the anarchy, what seems like the anarchy of the market, of individuals pursuing their own self-interests, buying and selling and so on, in fact, it's rationalized by what can be discovered as kind of general laws. So I'm pursuing my self-interest without realizing somehow that I'm participating in some rational process, which is going somewhere. It might not be a nice place, but it's going somewhere. And this is what Hegel calls the super rational absolute, the Geist, which we can grasp when we try to tell history in the round. I'll give one more. Of course, Marx takes this much further, this view, in terms of out of the conflict between classes, we find a pattern. Look at this, the arrogance of this, what I'm going to call positivist view, if you like, of this godlike sort of insight he has to essentially how we organize ourselves. And that nevertheless, there is a pattern that we can make sense of. And of course, it won't surprise you that Marx dedicated his book to Darwin, Kapital, Das Kapital, he dedicated to Darwin, because Marx believed that what he was doing in terms of explaining human history as basically out of conflict, we get superior ways of organizing production and distribution and exchange, and therefore ultimately superior ways of governing ourselves. What he believed he was doing for humans, he thought obviously that Darwin had done the same, that it's through the struggle between the cheetah and the gazelle that they, out of this anarchy and struggle, what actually happens is the perfection of species, the elevation to higher forms of being. So that was happening in markets. That process of the dialectic was happening in human history. Of course, Darwin had shown that it was the same in science. That's to say that reason, the rational, is something that happens almost despite individual action, almost despite individual human agency. As Hegel puts it, we might think we're rational beings, but in fact, it's the interweaving of the rational with the passions, the warp and the weft of that actually is to be grasped by the historian. The cunning of reason, he says, is manifest in it. Now, I do want to take some questions because, of course, ultimately, so therefore, if it looks to Hegel like individuals are grasping the moment, steering us somewhere, they're not. They're just standard bearers. Napoleon's just a world spirit. He's just personifying where we're all going, if you like. And that view, of course, is that this is the view that ultimately we can see things, we can see a process when we come to the end of it, when we get to the evening. As he says, the owl of Minerva spreads her wings only at dusk. We call the Middle Ages when we've got to the end of it. We can't see it when we're in the middle of it. The day makes sense at the end of the day. You know, my life makes sense, or my memory of my life makes more sense as I develop, attain self-consciousness, and remember something. It shifts in its meaning. And we all have that, I think. We all sense that as humans. This is the wisdom of Hegel. That this is why history is always being rewritten. Because our memory of the French Revolution, it attains different meanings as we attain higher self-consciousness. And that's happening with our memory of the British Empire at the moment. It's not going to look the same in 20 years' time to the way it looked, say 10, 50 years ago, 70 years ago. And so that's how Trotsky deals with this. He says, yes, of course, there's still accidents and things like that, but it's a natural selection of accidents. They all, if you like, cancel each other out. And there's still something where we're going. We're still going somewhere. And we've got to try and get there. So therefore, we're progressing. That's the 19th century view. We're going somewhere, and we know where we're going. And if you're a Whig, we're all going towards parliamentary democracy. We're going towards liberalism. That's the inexorable story, so it seemed to the Victorians, of the development of English history. Inexorably evolving, notice the Darwinian language, evolving into wider and wider participatory parliaments and ultimately democracy. And it's a good story, or so they thought. Because in the 20th century, this idea, and I'm going to call it a positivist idea, this idea that somehow Marx and Hegel and the Whigs had uncovered a development, a destination that was generally good, and it was objectively true, and we could all understand it, was lost. In the trenches, in the World War I, the catastrophe of World War I, the catastrophe of the Great Depression, the catastrophe of the rise of fascism, the industry, for example, the great achievement of the 19th century had in fact just brought about more efficient ways of us killing each other. That democracy could be subverted and distorted by tricksters, hucksters. And I think it's very telling that when Kenneth Clark did his Civilization TV series in the 1960s, he stopped in 1914. He couldn't get it. Why? And he just ended there. It ended. You know, even in the 1960s, he says, I quote, "We have no idea where we are going. I must concede that the future of civilization looks grim." And you know, out with that went a lot of self-confidence in the history writing profession, that they could actually even debate where they thought what they thought the trajectory was of human history. Here's H.A.L. Fisher writing in between the wars, pessimistic. He says, I cannot discern any plot, rhythm, or predetermined pattern. Those harmonies, the harmonies that animated Marx and Hegel, they are concealed from me. There is only one safe rule for the historian, that he should recognize in the development of human destinies the play of the contingent and the foreseen. The ground gained by our generation may be lost by the next. And so said H.A.L. Fisher, and I think that was the state of play. So am I therefore with them? Do I think, well, ultimately the 20th century and postmodernity means that in the end, we've just deconstructed. We can now we know the Victorians were wrong, and we're not heading towards some lovely place of whether you're a socialist, you know, a wonderful socialist utopia, whether you're a liberal, this benign liberal democracy, whether you're a Nazi, you know, the folk community, whatever utopia. Well, we know that these utopias have died in the mud of the 20th century, and postmodernists have it in the faculties of our universities that ultimately the author is dead, and all that matters is the reader. All that matters is what I think a text means. We're in this ultra relativism, and we can't get around it, and we're going to be shouting at each other. As Diane Purkis says, postmodernity has done for the historical profession. Well, no, not at all. I don't think that's true at all. And I'm going to the way I'm going to defend it is through this wonderful quote by an Italian liberal, Bernadotte Croce, who was living through Mussolini. I don't exactly know when he said this, but he's saying what we got to remember is that whatever we write reflects our present preoccupations. All history is contemporary, whatever we do. So why was Gibbon writing about the fall of the Roman Empire? Well, he was writing at a time where classicism was perceived as the greatest human achievement. Why was Elton saying there was a Tudor revolution in government, 16th century? Because he was writing at the time of the welfare state being formed in 1946-78. He was trying to plot the formation of the British state. Why is women's history, why is black history on the campuses at last in the 1960s and 70s? Well, because women and blacks at last are on the campuses of universities in the 1960s. There's a great book I really recommend on climate now. That climatology is very influential. That climate change has been is now historicized, and so we can understand now that in fact a lot of things that we thought were just down to human agency were down to shifts in climate itself. So therefore, our view of the past, and Hegel has it, is an interaction between the present and our construction of the past. It's an ongoing symbiosis of what has happened, that objective reality, and how we perceive it to have happened. So therefore, what's the key? The key, I think, is our self-consciousness. Our starting point to be objective in history is to be aware of our perspective. It has to be an all-round vision. We have to be aware of our time, the preoccupations of our time, the preoccupations of our identity, and of course the context of the people and period that we will be studying. We'll never be impartial, but we can distance ourselves from that partiality, and that is to be objective. We will be partial, but objective. That's my view. And I think the best historians are always aware of where they think their own biases lie. Because as we know, and as we're told, and as we all basically know, many of those consciences, those biases are unconscious. And Hegel says that the conscious has to become self-conscious. Therefore, history's unending, as our hopefully us human as we are, as we continue to live through time. The way that we interpret our past itself is unending. Itself is unfolding. And so Thomas Carlyle is right that the completeness of opinion is always approaching, never arrive. That was where Marx was wrong. That's where the Whigs were wrong. There is no destination. It's just a case of unfolding, and therefore that, ladies and gentlemen, is why history will always be rewritten. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop and look at some of the questions. Joanna, I'm so sorry. Greg, yep. Would you like to say something?
Oh, I was just making a point about which I think you've just made, which is that if you can imagine a court case that never actually concludes, but that what is happening is that you're being presented with evidence, and when, as we've seen in many court cases, when new evidence emerges, or indeed when we look at the judges summing up, as we've all seen some ludicrous judges summings up in the past, and when we look at that and think that was completely wrong, we change our view. And so I think it is possible to keep arriving at a better version of truth without having said that you arrive at that destination. So I totally agree with you about not arriving at a destination.
I'm going to pose thank you. I'm going to pose a question which I don't really have an answer to, but I'd be interested to see what people think. I'm always bothered by this, that when we look at something that happened in the past, we can say that we can look at it in two levels. We can say this is what they think they're doing, but actually this is what they're really doing. It's what Marx called false consciousness. So in Marx's hands, Marx would say, well, when a worker goes on strike, he thinks he's trying to get better wages for himself. What he's actually doing is contributing to the arrival of socialism. There's an objective truth to it. In medieval society, when they're beating the bands, they think they're driving away demons. Actually, they're not. What they're doing is they're creating these social behaviors that bind the community together. It's a social norm. It's a collective norm. That's to say, we have a wisdom about what our ancestors were doing, if you like, that they didn't have. I don't know what you think about that, or where anyone stands on that.
But slightly progressive. In other words, there's a little assumption in it that we now know better.
Yeah.
But I totally agree with it, as it happens. I think we do on so many different issues.
I think a fascinating one will be about the British Empire. If you read most British Empire histories, this is how it goes. It was acquired in a fit of absent-mindedness. British didn't mean to acquire it. It's kind of done as we do everything. Not by design. The East India Company does its thing and whatever. Now, is that good enough? I don't know if that'll be good enough for everyone now. Is there what really was the British Empire? I'm not so interested in what they thought they were doing. What really matters is its actuality and its impact. That's always a negotiation, I think, that historians have to negotiate to make. David Carradine wrote a very good book called Ornamentalism, where he basically said the British Empire is just an extension of the class system. Many British settlers overseas sought to create a full-scale replica of the elaborately graded social hierarchy they had left behind at home. So what they do in India is they just say, well, who's in charge? Right, we're going to make you really, really in charge now, and create this hierarchy, ultimately through which the British could control everyone. But essentially, in Carradine's hands, he says the British Empire is really just an extension of Britain. He writes race out of it. Now, therefore, do we then approach these histories and say, come on, we now know these things about our attitudes to race, so am I satisfied with that anymore? I don't know.
Do we have a question from Alex?
Yeah, I mean, really, I was just by pure chance, I was decluttering yesterday and I found a box of clippings from the Bosnian War in the 1990s, because my family's originally from Yugoslavia, as it was then. And it's really interesting looking back on it yesterday and how something, that those current events have now become sort of history, as things obviously do. But how, I'm trying to articulate it, but our view of what past events gets distilled as time goes on. It gets distilled into simpler and simpler view of the past. So for instance, for the First World War, for a lot of British people, the First World War is Flanders Fields, for instance. And when I tell them that my great-grandfather fought on the Salonika front in Macedonia alongside British soldiers, and he was treated by English nurses in a field hospital in the hills in Macedonia, lots of English people go, what was that about? And well, we don't do that in English history. We that front is completely, I mean, I never learnt about it at school for sure. And I don't really know what I'm saying, but more, as time goes on, doesn't history get distilled into simpler and simpler details in some ways? So this idea of reassessing history isn't a kind of a pure thing. It's based on those previous histories, which have kind of simplified things into your worldview. So for instance, for this Bosnia thing I was saying, I was really surprised going through the clippings yesterday, how many news articles were about Bosnians, Muslims fighting against Croats, and Croats having death camps from Muslims, and the Serbs fighting together with the Muslims against the Croats in some areas. And it was a complete mess. But the way it's talked about now is that it's Serb aggression and all of that kind of thing, and Serbs were the bad guys and all the rest were the good guys. And doesn't our history just get kind of distilled and simplified?
I hope that the best history, in fact, becomes diversified and becomes more sensitive to the kind of questions that they animate, for example, you. I mean, I suppose when First World War history was written in the 1960s, how many Kosovan kids were in British schools?
Yeah.
I mean, there weren't any. It was a story, you know, it was all about the Western Front, wasn't it? And generally white British soldiers. And then, of course, when Asian communities started to migrate towards Lancashire and West Yorks, history teachers are faced with a different constituency. Did we do anything in World War I? Well, of course they did. It had been written out, if you like, maybe not deliberately, but it simply wasn't a problem when they were designing these books in the 50s and 60s to all British classrooms, I suppose is the way I'd say it. And World War I has changed dramatically our interpretation of it in, if you like, a different direction, which is now someone like Gary Sheffield questions whether it was all just bloody slaughter and the generals got it all wrong. In fact, 1918 looks very much like World War II. The generals did learn that they had to use aircraft. Tanks were starting to be deployed. Small units were being, that's to say, the Blackadder view was a cultural trope, which essentially had been the function of Oh, What a Lovely War, that wonderful musical. I can't remember the woman who wrote it, Dorothy somebody, in the 1960s, but that somehow became a sort of cultural value. And then academic historians are saying something slightly different. So I suppose what I'm saying is, no, not simplifying. I would say that view, that vision of World War I has actually become more complex, and that's great. But you don't want history to become complex and therefore not accessible to the general reader. That's bad. And that's why we need people like Tom Holland, who can simplify, or rather, I don't mean simplify, but somehow distill, use the word distill, the complexity of what we now know into a manageable text.
But then do you see there's a big gulf between the general public and historians as quite sort of separate groups of people?
Yeah.
So you hear so ultra-nationalist sort of English, people recently sort of almost talking like Churchill personally sort of stormed Adolf Hitler's bunker and killed him himself, almost that kind of level of.
That's why I chose this as something to talk about for this series. I just think that history is going to become important because we now have a multiple identity society, and rightly minorities want to see themselves in this account of, well, it might no longer be national history. That maybe national history is dead. Maybe schools will have to start to think in terms of a global history, which is absolutely the polar opposite of what the Gove government was saying in 2010. I mean, the way of handling multiculturalism in 2010, 11, 12, and the problems when was it Merkel saying, or Cameron saying multiculturalism is dead, was, well, we want citizenship ceremonies. We want our, to get your citizenship, you have to learn Magna Carta. You had to learn when the guilds were formed, all this stuff. I wonder if that's really where we're going. Whether that indeed, that isn't going to be more, it's going to cause more problems, and in fact is not where we're headed.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. I think we probably have to stop it there. It's 2:02. I know we could carry on talking for hours, but thank you so much, Jonny. That was very informative and objective. If you would like to be enlightened further, you may be interested in signing up for Jonny's new evening class, The Great When. It's a history of London through its architecture, which starts in September. Jonny will teach a 10-lesson Zoom course, I think, every Wednesday evening on the built history of the capital from Roman Londinium to the present day. And the lessons will attempt to make sense of the physical reality we live in today through the story of the capital's enduring ability to reinvent itself after Roman abandonment, the Great Fire of 1666, the growth of its suburbia, and the Blitz. I think it even includes a Saturday walk or two, lockdown permitting, with lunch, Jonny, if I'm right.
Yeah, that's on hold, but yeah, hopefully eventually, Joe. Yeah.
Eventually, yes. If you can't wait until September, however, why not join Jonny at the same time next Thursday, when he will offer a brief historical overview on liberalism's debt to Christianity. And if you would like to find out more about Jonny's and other evening courses that we host for parents and alumni of the Latimer community, or indeed if you'd like to register to join Jonny's event next week, then please copy the links from the chat facility now. And you will also find a link there to the donations page, our forthcoming events, and a link to our brand new event video library, where you can now enjoy recordings of all our virtually speaking summer events programme at your leisure. That brings us to the end of our lunch hour. So if you would like to copy any of those links, please do so now before I close this meeting. Otherwise, thank you so much again for joining. Thank you, Jonny, for your wonderful talk.
That's
and I hope to see you all again very soon. Enjoy the sunshine.